he's widely considered the greatest actor of his generation, perhaps of all time. 3 Academy Awards for Best Actor. Performances so transformative that audiences forget they're watching someone pretend. Daniel Day-Lewis didn't just play characters, he became them so completely that the line between actor and role seemed to vanish entirely. But what did that level of commitment actually cost him? What happens to a human being who disappears into darkness for months at a time, who carries the weight of tormented souls, who refuses to break character even when cameras stop rolling? Today, we're exploring the truth that Daniel Day-Lewis has finally opened up about after retiring from acting in 2017. Truth about the psychological toll of his method, the personal relationships damaged by his obsessive process, the mental health struggles that nobody saw coming, and the heartbreaking reason why the greatest actor alive decided he simply couldn't do it anymore. This isn't a story about an artist at the peak of his powers. This is about what it actually costs to achieve that kind of perfection, and why Daniel Day-Lewis ultimately decided the price had become too high to pay. The pain behind his greatest performances is more intense than anything you saw on screen. Daniel Michael Blake Day-Lewis was born in 1957 in London to an extraordinary family. His father, Cecil Day-Lewis, was Britain's poet laureate, one of the nation's most respected literary figures. His mother, Jill Balkan, was a renowned actress. Daniel grew up surrounded by art, literature, and impossibly high standards for creative excellence. But here's what shaped him more than privilege or pedigree. His father died of cancer when Daniel was just 15 years old. In interviews decades later, Daniel has described this as the defining trauma of his young life. He watched his father deteriorate, witnessed his mother's grief, and felt utterly helpless to stop any of it. This experience with mortality, suffering, and the fragility of life would later inform every character he played. After his father's death, Daniel became rebellious and directionless. He dropped out of boarding school, worked as a cabinet maker, and seemed more interested in avoiding expectations than meeting them. Acting wasn't an obvious path, it was almost an escape, a way to be anyone other than the grieving son of a famous poet. He trained at the Bristol Old Vic Theatre School, but even there, he was different. While other actors studied technique, Daniel was developing something more extreme an approach to acting that required him to completely inhabit a character's physical, emotional, and psychological reality. He wasn't learning lines and hitting marks. He was undergoing transformations that bordered on possession. His early film roles in the 1980s showed flashes of brilliance, but it was his performance in My Beautiful Laundrette and then A Room with a View that revealed something extraordinary was emerging. This wasn't conventional acting. This was something deeper and more unsettling. The breakthrough came with My Left Foot in 1999, where Daniel played Christy Brown, an Irish writer with cerebral palsy. Daniel stayed in character throughout the entire shoot, remaining in a wheelchair, refusing to break his physical contortion, and having crew members feed him between takes. He insisted on being treated exactly as Christy would have been treated. The performance was staggering, and it won him his first Oscar at age 32. But what nobody talked about then was what this process was doing to his body and mind. Daniel spent months contorting his body into painful positions, and he's admitted that he damaged his ribs during filming from maintaining the physical posture so intensely. The line between dedication and self-harm was already becoming blurred. After My Left Foot, Daniel Day-Lewis could have done anything. Hollywood was offering him leading man roles, romantic comedies, action films, the kind of parts that make actors wealthy and famous. Instead, he chose projects that would allow him to explore human suffering, violence, and moral complexity. In 1992, he played the lead in The Last of the Mohicans. While this seems like a conventional action-adventure film, Daniel approached it with his characteristic extremism. He lived in the wilderness for months before filming, learning to track, hunt, and build canoes. He refused modern conveniences and isolated himself from civilization to understand what his character's life would have actually been like. Then came In the Name of the Father in 1993, where he played Gary Conlon, a man wrongfully imprisoned for an IRA bombing. Daniel had himself confined to a prison cell 4 days before filming, lost dangerous amounts of weight, and remained in character even when visiting his elderly mother, speaking to her in Jerry's Belfast accent rather than his own voice. His mother later described how disturbing It was to have a stranger wearing her son's face sitting across from her, but the role that truly broke. Something inside him was Bill the Butcher in Gangs of New York. Filming took place over a grueling 18 months in Rome. Daniel stayed in character the entire time, speaking in Bill's accent even during breaks, sharpening knives between takes, and inhabiting the violent sociopath's mindset for so long that crew members became genuinely unsettled by his presence. He's admitted in interviews that playing Bill required him to access parts of his own psyche that frightened him. Rage, cruelty, the capacity for violence that exists in all humans but that most of us never explore. For over a year, he walked around with those dark emotions as his constant companions. During the filming of Gangs of New York, Daniel caught pneumonia but refused to seek modern medical treatment because it would break character. He nearly died from this decision. His pneumonia worsened because he insisted on wearing only the period-appropriate clothing his character would have worn. Even in Rome's cold winter, after Gangs of New York wrapped, Daniel took 5 years off from acting. This wasn't a strategic career move, it was survival. He's described feeling hollowed out, depleted, and uncertain whether he could safely return to that level of immersion again. When Steven Spielberg offered Daniel the role of Abraham Lincoln, it seemed like the perfect project, a chance to embody one of history's most important figures in a film about the passage of the 13th Amendment abolishing slavery. For most actors, this would be the opportunity of a lifetime. For Daniel Day-Lewis, it became something closer to a spiritual crisis. The preparation was extraordinary. Daniel spent over a year researching Lincoln, reading every biography, studying photographs and descriptions of his physicality, listening to linguistic experts recreate how Lincoln might have sounded. He learned to write with his left hand as Lincoln had, adopted Lincoln's posture and gait, and once again remained in character throughout the months-long shoot. But this time, something different happened. Daniel has spoken about how playing Lincoln felt less like acting and more like channeling someone who existed beyond him. He described feeling an enormous responsibility, not just to Spielberg or the audience, but to Lincoln himself, to history, to the millions of people whose freedom depended on the actions Lincoln took. The weight of that responsibility was crushing. Daniel has admitted that he felt Lincoln's exhaustion, his depression, the toll that leadership during the Civil War took on the man. He carried that heaviness with him for months, and it didn't simply disappear when filming ended. His performance was predictably extraordinary. He won his third Best Actor Oscar, an unprecedented achievement. But in his acceptance speech, there was something in his voice that suggested weariness more than triumph. He thanked the Academy, thanked Lincoln for letting him borrow his character, and seemed relieved that the inhabitation was finally over. Sally Field, who played Mary Todd Lincoln, later described how difficult it was to work with Daniel during this film, not because he was unprofessional, but because he was so completely absorbed in Lincoln that she felt like she was truly performing with someone from another century, rather than with a colleague. What Daniel revealed later was that Lincoln had pushed him to a breaking point. The emotional weight of carrying that character, man dealing with a nation at war, widespread death, and the moral crisis of slavery had been almost unbearable. He finished the film, but something inside him knew he couldn't sustain this level of intensity indefinitely. After Lincoln, Daniel took another extended break. Years passed, with no new projects announced. Hollywood assumed he was simply being selective, waiting for the perfect role. But what was really happening was that Daniel was questioning whether he could continue acting at all. When he finally returned, it was for Phantom Thread in 2017, directed by Paul Thomas Anderson. Daniel played Reynolds Woodcock, a fastidious fashion designer in 1950s London, whose controlled existence is disrupted by a young woman. On the surface, it seemed like a departure, no historical figure, no extreme physical transformation, no obvious suffering. But those close to the production described Daniel as more intense than ever. He learned to sew, studied haute couture design, and insisted on wearing the restricting period clothing throughout. More significantly, he inhabited the character's obsessive perfectionism and need for control with such completeness that it began to feel less like playing a character and more like manifesting aspects of his own personality. Paul Thomas Anderson has described watching Daniel work with a mixture of awe and concern. Here was an actor at the absolute peak of his craft, delivering one of the most nuanced performances imaginable. but there was something in his eyes that suggested this might be goodbye. During the filming of Phantom Thread, Daniel made a decision. He was going to retire from acting. The announcement came in June 2017, before the film was even released. Daniel's representatives released a brief statement saying he would no longer be working as an actor and asked for privacy regarding this decision. No explanation was given. No dramatic exit interview. Just a simple declaration that the greatest actor of his generation was walking away. The announcement shocked Hollywood. Actors in their prime don't retire us, especially not actors with Daniel's gifts and success. But Daniel was adamant. In the limited interviews he gave, he explained that this wasn't about dissatisfaction with the industry or a desire for new challenges. It was simpler and more profound than that. He couldn't do it anymore. What has Daniel revealed about why he stopped? In a rare New York Times interview, he admitted that during the filming of Phantom Thread, he experienced something he'd never felt before, sensed that the process of acting had become unsustainable, even destructive. He described it as a sudden awareness that the method he'd been using for decades was no longer something he could survive. So, what exactly did Daniel Day-Lewis's method acting cost him? Now that he's stepped away and had time to reflect, he's been more open about the toll his career took. First, there's the physical damage. Years of extreme physical transformations, weight loss and gain, maintaining unnatural postures, and refusing medical care for the sake of authenticity left his body worn down. He's dealt with chronic pain from some of the contortions his roles required. Then there's the psychological impact. Daniel has discussed experiencing depression after finishing films, a phenomenon he describes as the difficulty of returning to himself after months of being someone else. When you've spent 6 months living as a 19th century sociopath or a paralyzed artist, who are you when the cameras stop? Daniel found that transition increasingly difficult with each role. His relationships suffered too. He's been married to filmmaker Rebecca Miller since 1996, and they have 2 sons together. But Daniel has acknowledged that his process made him an absent husband and father, even when physically present. How do you maintain intimate relationships when you're refusing to break character for months? How do you parent when you're psychologically inhabiting someone from another century? His son from a previous relationship with French actress Isabelle Adjani has spoken about growing up with a father who would disappear for long stretches, not just physically, but psychologically, becoming someone else entirely. Daniel has also revealed something darker. There were times when he wasn't entirely sure he could come back from certain roles. After playing Bill the Butcher, after channeling Lincoln's depression, after inhabiting various forms of human darkness and suffering, he worried that pieces of those characters might remain embedded in his psyche permanently. The mental health implications of his method have only recently been discussed openly. Psychologists have pointed out that what Daniel was doing, deliberately dismantling his own identity to inhabit others, is potentially traumatic. It's a form of dissociation that, while controlled and purposeful, still carries psychological risks. What finally broke through his resistance to stopping was, according to his limited statements, a moment of clarity during Phantom Thread. He suddenly understood that his method wasn't just intense, it was harmful, and the performances, no matter how acclaimed, weren't worth sacrificing his mental health, his relationships, or his sense of self since retiring. Daniel Day-Lewis has lived quietly in Ireland with his wife Rebecca Miller. He's returned to woodworking, a craft he loves and practiced early in life. He spends time with his family. He exists as Daniel Day-Lewis, the person rather than Daniel Day-Lewis, the vessel for other people's stories. He's adamant that his retirement is permanent. This isn't a break or a pause. It's a complete exit from a profession that defined him for decades. In rare public appearances, he seems lighter somehow. Less burdened by the intensity that marked his acting years, Rebecca Miller has spoken about how different he is now, more present, more himself, less haunted by the ghosts of characters past. His children have their father back in a way. They never fully had him during his acting career. There are occasional rumors about potential returns, directors who'd love to work with him, scripts being sent his way. But Daniel has been clear. He's done. The pain behind those performances was real, and he's chosen healing over artistry. Daniel Day-Lewis gave us some of cinema's most unforgettable performances. He showed us what's possible when an actor commits absolutely everything to a role. But what he's taught us in retirement might be even more valuable. There are limits to what we should sacrifice for our work. No matter how important that work might seem, the pain behind his greatest roles wasn't metaphorical. It was physical, psychological, and relational. It was real damage to his body from extreme physical transformations. It was genuine psychological distress from inhabiting darkness. It was relationships strained by his inability to be fully present as himself. And ultimately, Daniel made a choice that few people at the top of their field have the courage to make. He walked away. Not because he failed, not because he couldn't compete anymore, but because he recognized that his method, for all the artistic brilliance it produced, was unsustainable. His retirement is a reminder that even genius has its costs, that perfection demands prices we might not be willing to pay, and that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is stop doing the thing you're best at because it's destroying you. Daniel Day-Lewis will be remembered for Lincoln, for Bill the Butcher, for Christy Brown, and for all the extraordinary characters he brought to life. But perhaps his final act, choosing himself over his arties, the most important performance of all. It's a reminder that we are more than our work, that health matters more than achievement, and that knowing when to stop is its own form of wisdom. The greatest actor of his generation taught us how to completely inhabit a character. But by walking away, he's teaching us something even more valuable: how to inhabit our own lives.